You are all welcome. We will wait for just 1 or 2 minutes for everyone to come in and we'll start. You're all welcome to this webinar where we are talking about resourcing women's rights movements for a just and inclusive future, an event that is co-hosted by Womankind Worldwide and other key partners, including Zamara Foundation, Akina Mama of Afrika, LOOM-Nepal, and FEMNET. And with us also, we have been joined by AWID, a group organization that is also going to speak to us about the status of resourcing women's rights organizations and movements. So we are meeting today in the margin of generation equality, which is a multi-stakeholder convening that brings together governments, women's rights organizations, and civil society organizations, and businesses to talk about gender equality and women's rights to accelerate the vision of Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action. A time when it is about 26 years since the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action was adopted by governments, with a key role played by feminist and women's rights organizations. And who knew that after 26 years, the business of women's rights and gender equality won't just simply be the business of women's rights organizations and civil society, but that different stakeholders will have a huge interest in that conversation, which is what we are seeing when we have a multi-stakeholder discussion going on right now, starting tomorrow. And I think if you compare with what was happening 26 years ago and what is happening now, there's a huge difference in terms of interest in women's rights and gender equality. But whether that interest is leading and is, being felt by women and girls and trans and intersex people at this particular time in terms of how they are enjoying their human rights, that's a question to ask. And I think this conversation will allow us to ask that question in terms of rhetoric that we hear from different stakeholders when it comes to women's rights, and how that matches actions to support and facilitate those at the front line, those that are risking their lives to advance women's rights and gender equality. And so you're all welcome to this conversation, to value this conversation. We know that there is a lot of Zoom fatigue happening all across the world, but yet you choose to still engage and engage actively. And so with us today, we have really a fantastic lineup of speakers that are going to speak about resourcing women's rights organizations and feminist movements, to showcase, to share the status when we speak about that, and why that is important in terms of advancing women's rights. We know that women's rights organizations and feminist movements are at the forefront of transformational change, but yet when it comes to resources, the quality resources that needs to reach them to facilitate their work, that remains a huge problem. We have with us Ewudi today that is going to speak, they are going to help us speak about the recent briefing that they shared, that they have published in terms of the status of funding women's rights organization, with really a situation that we shouldn't be speaking about 26 years down the road after the adoption of the Beijing Declaration Platform for Action. And also to note that, resourcing women's rights organizations and movements, even though it is such a huge, important, critical factor in advancing women's rights, it's not the only barriers that feminist movements do face, but nevertheless, it's critical and really important in facilitating the work that feminist organizations and movements are doing. And so I'm going to now move forward in terms of sharing the ground rules for this conversation. One is to note that this is going to be recorded, so I hope that everyone is fine with that. If you are not, please do let us know. We also call upon you to maintain a safe environment for all of us. And if we notice any offensive or any abusive or discriminatory language from any participant, the participants will be removed from the call and will not be readmitted. Please, we have the function of questions and answers, a Q&A. Please do submit any questions or comments you have in that function. And also, if you would like to tweet about this conversation, use the hashtag Generation Equality, Act for Equal, and also tag the co-organizers, Womankind, Akina Mama Afrika, FEMNET, LOOM-Nepal, and Zamara. My colleague Christina will put that information in the chat so that you have it with you. And also just to say that before I move to the next part of this conversation, just to say that as part of this conversation, Womankind will be launching Her Voice Fund, which is a fund that is an initiative of Womankind that is going to be supporting Womankind partners in advancing strategic advocacy and influencing at all levels, at the national level, at the regional level, and at the global level. More information will be shared at the time of the launch. I would now like to start a video before we continue with the program.
Being able to access flexible and unrestricted funds means being able to do a strategic advocacy in more enlarged way, reaching more beneficiaries, meeting more actors, meeting more than one issue. And for instance, for WCC, we would like to influence finance institutions so that they are able to target women with disabilities and empower them economically by giving them loans, training them to be good entrepreneurs, and for future, so that they're able also to create wealth like everybody else in the society.
LOOM is one of the organizations in Nepal led by the youths. Its strategy is to advocate and work in the diverse issue of women and queer people related to sexuality. In the difficult situation of pandemic, LOOM is mainly working with a group of women who are in a vulnerable situation, such as young women, sex workers, and LGBTI people, as they don't have direct access to the government services. LOOM mainly focus on livelihood and safety and security component of these group of people. Thus, it would be easier to address the need as per the requirement through such flexible fund. Also, LOOM works with the community level organization which are solely led by women's group. LOOM support these organizations to build their organization strategy and for the economic sustainability of the organization as well as the group. Hence, such flexible fund will definitely support in LOOM's movement and activism towards women's right movement.
Funding for women's rights organization is really a critical topic and conversation that needs urgent redress, and particularly for young feminists or young women organizing. For young feminist organization like YWLI, unrestricted and flexible funding will ensure that the organization and also those working in the organizations and beneficiaries grow, and also we are able to work according to our own context and also address the needs and lived realities of young women and adolescent girls. And at the end of it, we are able to actualize our mission.
Thank you very much for that. So now we are going to start part one of this conversation. And just to note that part two will be moderated by my co-moderator, my colleague, Kavinia Makawu, who will introduce herself when that time comes. So I'm going to start with a conversation with two wonderful women. And the first one, I'm going to introduce her just now. And that's Fenya. Fenya Fischler. Fenya currently is working as a resourcing feminist movements coordinator at EWID and is based in Brussels, where she's active in various grassroots queer and feminist collectives. You're welcome, Fenya, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
And my second person in conversation is going to be Esther Kimani. Esther Wambui Kimani is the founder of Zamara Foundation, a feminist organization working towards strengthening the voices of young women and girls in marginalized communities to challenge and transform the status quo. She has extensive experience in feminist leadership, development, movement building for social change, advancement of women and girls' rights, and advocacy. Esther holds a degree in psychology from Egerton University and a high diploma in psychological counseling from Kenya Methodist University. So I'm going to start with you, Fenya. I know that EWID just released a report, Where is the Money for Feminist Organizing? And I also know that EWID has been doing this work for really some time now, asking where is the money? And so in this recent report, which was released just this year, can you share with us what are the key take-home points from the report on the current landscape for resourcing feminist movements? Is there anything different from other reports that you have released previous years?
Yeah, so unfortunately, there's not a big change. That is maybe the key takeaway. And a lot of the data that was in the video is part of the report as well. So that's already been shared, which is great. But I do think it's worth repeating that firstly, what you mentioned in the introduction, that feminist movements are the key factor in achieving, positive policy change in terms of violence against women, in terms of gender justice, but they're still not receiving the resources to match, their role in that. And there's a lot of commitments, there's a lot of interest in gender justice, but it's just not, the rhetoric doesn't match the reality. Just to repeat what we saw in the video, we can see that 40%, 48%, which is almost half of women's rights and feminist organizations from the global south still have a budget of under $30,000 US. And that we also need to put all of this in the context of the rising backlash against feminist movements, increasing fundamentalisms, and all of that. I think that context is really important to mention as well.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that. It's really interesting that we all agree that feminist organizations and movements play a key role in bringing about change. And yet, even when resources do increase for gender equality, where we know that the change makers mainly have been women's movements, those resources don't actually reach these change makers that we all agree on. And I wonder what happens in between, the evidence that is very clear, the fact that we all agree on it in different sectors, but when it comes to actually getting these resources in the hands of those that are doing that change, then it becomes a challenge indeed, as we all know. And so so I wanted you to maybe, because sometimes also when we talk about women's rights organizations, we just talk about women's rights organizations, although we all face similar challenges, but we know that situations can be even more difficult for those that are working at the intersection of gender and other identities that are oftentimes marginalized, such as the LGBTQ, the young women, the women with disabilities. In the video, one of the women is working with women with disabilities. And I know that the situations for these groups can even be worse. Can you talk to us what you have found out?
Yes, just I'm struggling to unmute myself. Yeah, absolutely. So when we look at groups like sex workers groups, trans groups, indigenous, migrant, or LGBTQIA groups, the situation is worse. We have some data, for example, from Australia, that found that the median budget for LGBTQ groups in 2017 was only 11,713 per year. And then when you look at trans groups, it's almost 56% have budget under $10,000 US. I think, again, to mention the context of the anti-rights funding, there's data from the Global Philanthropy Project that shows that the anti-gender movement between 2013 and 17, in fact, received $3.7 billion US in funding, which was more than triple the worldwide funding for LGBTQI groups. So that is, I think, really important to keep in mind. And then in terms of some more data that we have on young feminists is that over 91% of young feminist groups responded in research by Frida and Awid that lack of financial resources is their top challenge. And a lot of them, over half, have incomes of under $5,000 US as well. So the situation is definitely clearly worse when you look at people facing multiple oppressions, historical marginalization, etc.
Yeah, thank you. No, thank you very much for that. And I also, when I was reading the report, I also noticed that there is also regional disparities, that different regions are also facing even harder challenges when it comes to accessing funding that they do need. And just to know that actually within this conversation, we have Manisha who will talk more about, the issues around facing LGBTQI, because her organization works with that specific group. And also we have Esther, who is going to talk more about young feminist organizing. And so Esther, I'm actually coming to you now. As you know, as a well-known, well-experienced young feminist who is grounded in feminist organizing at the country level, but also you have done some work across countries regionally. Your experience of accessing resources as a young feminist person working to organize and mobilize young feminists to address issues affecting young women and girls. Can you speak to us, building on what you shared with us?
Yeah, and thank you very much, Dina. I'm so glad to be here. And just building onto what Fair has mentioned is that, just going a little bit deeper in terms of the experience that we've had at Zamara Foundation is in terms of actually the challenge of even accessing those limited resources that we have. So I would speak to, the issues, so the challenges that we've had for us to not be able to access those funding and those the support. And one of the biggest issues that we've actually experienced is the fact that, of the different donor requirements that are there, that you find that for a loose network of young feminists or a feminist organization that was registered just maybe 2 years ago, they're not able to meet those standards. Standards like, being able to have human resource policies, being able to have procurement policies, being able to have at least 4 years audit or 3 years audit. So if you've never had any income, how are you able to get that audit? And if, for example, the income that you got was just $5,000 for the last previous years, that was more activity based, it becomes really challenging to develop an audit based on that. And because of that, then what that means, it means that then you're not able to access, even start applying for that job, because for that funding, because the requirements themselves have already cut you off. So that's one of the other, some of the experience that you've had. The other one that, I wanted to speak about, which Fair also spoke about, is in terms of just the lack of insufficient funding and in terms of limited funding, especially for core support. So you find that, within the different consortium that you will be part of in your feminist organizing, at times you're responding to an issue that has come about. For example, you want to ensure that there is voices of young feminists within global spaces or regional policy influencing spaces. So you see, that is a response to ensure that then you have a young feminist there. But then you get just, support for travel. What about, the work, the staff time, so the co-funding? So the insufficient of funding goes beyond that. It's not there, it's limited, but it's also restricted. So you're not able to really support the young feminists, the young women that are doing the work. And because of that, then you find that within the young feminist organizations, there's a lot of turnover because you're not able to sustain staff, or you sustain young feminists to do that. And the other challenge that has been there, and even for us at Zamara Foundation that I'll speak about and through our experience, is the fact that in terms of the requirements, that one of the requirements is that then some funder wants you to have to apply for 50% of your total annual income. That means that if your annual income is maybe $5,000 that you got for last year, which was activity, so you can only apply for 2,500. So, and 2,500, it's really not enough for a small organization. So, or even a feminist organizing, for an advocacy, because that means that maybe you'll only pay for few people to attend that advocacy processes. So you find that then with these different requirements that are there is little investment in community and feminist organizations to do the work. And those are the ones that are doing the most work within the community. And you find that then the funding, we lose the funding then, because then the funding goes to more established organizations. But then I must say, I know my time is almost up and I'll talk about the recommendation, but I must also say that even with all these, challenges that we've had, we've actually seen some feminist, funders that are trying to bridge that gap. And, when you read Ewid's report, you find that, Global Fund for Women really fund, organization with low budgets. We know, other funders like Agents Action Fund, Afrika also does that. And we are hoping that now that we are launching the Her Voice Fund, we'll be able to fund feminist organization and young feminist organization, and you're able to fund even the co-funding, so that then we have restricted and unrestricted funding that can be able to help us do the advocacy work. So I don't know if you want me to talk about the recommendation now or later on.
No, thanks, Esther. No, thanks, Esther. It's really interesting that you already touch on issues around co-support, because oftentimes when we say we are resourcing advocacy, and I think that's what we have found out at Womankind, and which is what has motivated us to think about launching Voice Fund, so that we can mobilize and make available resources for advocacy. And it is important to realize that actually supporting advocacy is not simply to buy a ticket and pay for accommodation for an individual woman to be in the policy spaces, but it's a lot of groundwork that takes time, preparing and building power, collective power of feminists to be able to actually have effective and impactful advocacy. So that is really an important point to note for all donors who might be in the room and hearing us today, that advocacy goes beyond just funding advocacy as travels, but more like doing resourcing groundwork, so core support, but also making sure that those resources are flexible, so that organizations and individuals doing the work can choose to use those resources as they see fit. And I think that comes with the trust. So the question, I think, to donors, do we trust feminist movements, young feminist organizations, to be able to give them flexible resources and trust that they will use them in a way that is impactful? And I think that we are in this conversation when generation equality is happening, and there is a whole focus of achieving gender equality in all generations, and definitely if we don't focus on young women, that I think will be a failure on all our parts. So I think going forward, I wanted you to just share a few recommendations to generation equality leaders that are meeting from tomorrow. What should change? Like having seen all the issues you have raised and challenges, how can those be addressed?
I think for me, what I can say is that, we already have, committed funds that, within the generation equality that are being put together in one basket to really strengthen the youth movement and youth leadership. And for me, the recommendation is to ensure that then generation equality and action coalitions direct this funding to feminist organizing, feminist-led and run organizations that are working at the community level, because they're the ones that are able to actually be able to convene collective power, to build feminist power, challenge patriarchy and status quo within the community. So I feel like we already have a lot of call to have, to have committed funds for youth leadership, but then also have a little bit of portion that goes directly to feminist-led organization and run organization. The other recommendation for me that I would want to speak about is really about capacity strengthening for feminist-led organizations, that the Action Coalition and Generation Equality, to ensure that then we capacity build organizations for feminist leadership, transformational literacy, and systems that think about, the issues from an intersectional point of view and have that power analysis, so that then, by the time this relationship you have with the feminist organization is over, they can actually attract bigger funding and bigger support. And it's because of your investment to build their capacity to be able to analyze issues from an intersectional approach, to analyze issues, so that then you get to a point where the power is almost the same. You have the same powers when it comes to the work and understanding of issues. And I think one last thing that I must mention is the fact that, UN Women, I'm hoping that you're in this call, and of course larger funders, that the mechanisms and practices of this bigger multilateral funders is that it's so difficult to maneuver, because then because of those institutional and practices and mechanism, it becomes difficult for organizations like Zamara to actually access those funding, and we actually don't need those funding. So for me, I would say to ensure that then you put mechanism and practices in place to resource and support feminists in a flexible and direct manner, so that then we also remove the strategic partner, component where they say, oh, we can give you this money, but we have to channel it to our strategic partner. So if you have those mechanisms that are really easier and practices that are simpler, then that means then we'll have young feminist organization being able to access those funding. And then maybe just last one, Dina, last one. I think one of the last one I would say is for us to have really spaces, co-created spaces where there'll be co-learning, co-creation, for specifically for resource mobilization for young women and youth-focused organizations, so that then these spaces, people are able to learn from each other. People, youth, not feminist organizations are able to learn from the amazing experience feminists like you, Dina, and of course and Womankind International, so that then by the time we have this trusted relationship and you're able to let this feminists fly, allow me to use that language, then we have these spaces where we share learning and we are able to grow from them. So for me, that's the last one I just added, but but I think those three I wanted to mention those. Thank you.
No, thank you, Esther. And also, I just wanted to, by the way, we are Womankind Worldwide, not Womankind International.
Womankind Worldwide.
And I think the issue you raised about capacity building, I know that it is really key, but also I know it has been misunderstood from oftentimes what feminists mean, to really look at deprioritize capacity building in a way that it is a platform and a resource to share knowledge and to facilitate those with the knowledge and expertise to be able to use those. Oftentimes when we talk about capacity building, oftentimes people understand it as, let's train these individual women, they lack skills and competences.
Yeah.
But the capacity building we're talking about is more about strengthening the organization, investing in the organization so that they can be able to build their own capacity and to have platforms for sharing knowledge and building on that. I wanted to just yeah, okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, true. Institutional strengthening is the key thing there, and not workshops and training. So totally, thank you. Yeah.
Thanks. Okay, great. So our time, two of us, is over, but we'll come back to you, Fenya. I would like you to think about some of the examples of donors who are kind of stepping forward and being more bold and trusting feminist organizations and actually funding them directly, because we know those examples do exist. And one of the Ewid and Mama Cash report actually highlights some of the examples of donors that are stepping on the plate, that are being bold and overcoming the fear, because oftentimes from donors, we do think, with organizations maybe don't have enough capacity to handle this amount of money, or they don't have absorption capacity and all those kind of fears. And I want to come back to you later to share those examples of those donors who are stepping to the plate, so that other donors can hear that it is possible. But for now, I'm going to invite Kinyonga Dolikas, a young feminist who is going to share with us a spoken word called Our Truth. And I just want to say that oftentimes when we bring young feminists or young women in the space, we do look at them as entertainers, but this is completely not the point. The point is that, of course, we can do with entertainment as feminist movements and individuals. But at the same time, beyond entertainment, Dolikas is spoken word is also educative. And so this is also her intervention in terms of the powerful message that she's going to share with us. And yeah, Dorcas, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for having me here today, and I hope we can all learn from something from what I'm going to say. So I'm going to start. I hope you can all hear me well.
Yes, we can.
Okay. Spoken word. Rights are rights and justice is justice. Men or women, the need to live is the same. Why are rhinos killed for their horns and elephants for their tusk? It's greed, nothing but greed. From dawn to dusk, jokes about feminism and stereotypes about feminists persist, but still women can't resist. There are people who believe that we don't need feminism today, but trust me, it sends a lot of impacts away. Women have struggled for equality and against oppression for centuries. A very few funds, some objectives are accomplished barely. There have been many extraordinary young girls and women who have played an important role in the feminist movements, but only a few have been advocates on women issues. There have been many feminist movements which has lately been making a lot of improvements, but only a few has successfully succeeded. We are entitled to human rights and women's rights are human rights. Feminism is equality for all since the beginning of time, helped reduce a lot of crime. Women and the young girls are gaining, it still remains a bigger workload. In a world of pandemic full of hindrances and challenges, how it comes, how it goes, and always seems to flow, but still the movements have tried to stay firm, even though the wind wasn't calm. When feminist movements arrives, you know exactly what it is. It's the salvation out of sacrifice, the peace out of problems, the dreams out of drawbacks, the blade out of burden. Just like a hope necklace, you would have recognized it at first glance. It has become a reason women and young girls found their confidence. It brought a fresh new season. We all had assurance. It brings better actions not only for the nation, but for the future generation and erases the destruction. When feminism grew, impossibilities became a few. It stretches like a trampoline. It made women strong, makes difficulties disappear slowly like baby teeth losing parts of them they thought they needed. In the end, the difficulties vanished like an immature magician. It found solutions that made them strong, gave them hope and a winning song, makes them feel like being free, building a better future after we. That is why we need to resource the movements, send off the discouragements, speed up the enforcement. It is not the passion that unites us, rather it's the vulnerabilities that bind us. One note does not make a symphony, one artist does not make an orchestra. That is why we need help one another. Women rights organizations need adequate resources to raise the enforcement, deliver the ambition, and avoid the prohibition. Women need to rise up, rise their weakness for kindness, their fakeness for boldness, neglect their thickness for changes. They need to rise up, and without these feminist movements, it's still a dream. I say she, I mean a woman. I say she, I mean a girl. I say she, I mean a very important group in our society. She refuses to back down, sit down, or calm down. She wants to rise up, grow up, and move up. Because you questioning and stopping she is you questioning the feminist movements. We need the government, the states, the agencies to make the decision of which role do they need to play and support these movements? Which importance of the movements will they defend the least and blend the most and work and succeed and carry the lead? Because resourcing these feminist movements is vital to the sustainable change needed. Not only that, having feminist leadership leads to a more positive environment around. where development can be easily found. It closes the gender pay gap, provides what movements lack, helps to drive effective solutions and bring up innovation. We shouldn't feel defeated even when it seems that the society is conceded. 2 steps forward, not 2 steps back. Whatever it takes, women and young girls must not lack. Feminist solutions on women's rights have confessed. They help to clear up the mess. That is why we need adequate funds for the process in building a just and inclusive future. We can save women in an hour because where there's roots, there's power, but we are more than the topsoil. We skip and jump and dance and fall between the harsh challenges that women and young girls conceive. Feminist movement support is all that we need. As a step forward, we launched Womankind Worldwide, a policy and advocacy initiative helping up the feminist movements, because the women deserve the future, we deserve the future, and for a just and inclusive future, we need strong support, we need enough funds, we need the women's rights organizations to stand strong. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jerica. That's really, really powerful and a strong message to all of us. Indeed, we need to support feminist organizations and movements and all the beautiful things you have said, about freedom, about hope, and about, really remembering that, it's the women organizations and feminist movement that clear the mess at the end of it, even when we haven't made the mess. So thank you for the powerful message. Do you have any specific recommendation? And I just wanted to say that Dorcas is an artivist, someone who combines art and activism, and still a student calling in from Tanzania, but found time to, to excuse herself from her school to be with us today, and that is extremely appreciated and valuable. Do you have any recommendation on how you think as feminist organizations ourselves can collaborate with activists like you, like yourself? And if you have thought about it,
as women's rights organization, I think women's rights organizations should collaborate effectively with activists by allowing them to advocate and giving them a chance to, sometimes when the artists are making these things like what I'm doing, it's more easier when we advocate and we see those girls and young women like face to face, or we see them. But the way we do it, we just use information from how they get those organizations. But if they could allow us to advocate, even mentor them, it could be easy for us to get more information and make more powerful works.
Thank you. So collaborating and ensuring that you're part of the movement, it would also strengthen the messages. Thank you so much, Dorcas. So on that note, I want to move us forward and hand over to Kavinya. And just to say that my name is Dina Musindarezo. I'm Director of Policy and Communication at Womankind Worldwide, dialing in from Nairobi, Kenya. Kavinya, I hand over to you to take us forward.
Thank you very much, Dina, for that, and to all the other panelists who've gone ahead and given us those powerful messages. My name is Kavinya Makau. I'm an African feminist. I'm currently working as a policy and advocacy manager at Womankind Worldwide and in charge of violence against women and girls. So I'm going to shift the conversation a little bit in discussion with Manisha from Loom-Nepal and Faith from Akina Mama wa Afrika. Manisha, I just wanted to ask you a question. And even before I do that, perhaps also just tell you a little bit about Manisha as we discuss. Manisha Shrestha is a Nepalese social activist and is a senior program coordinator at Loom-Nepal. It's been 1.5 years since she started working within the organization. She advocates and works with diverse groups of women and queer people related to sexuality as a right, and for feminist organizing, development, collaborating with community level organizations that are solely led by women. She also plays a key and crucial role in bridging the collective power of women's activists through multi-generational collaboration. And she also believes in transformation of leadership to newer generations, leading to collective solidarity and actions. So Manisha, welcome to the conversation. My question for you, first question is, as an individual that is working in an organization that prioritizes movement strengthening as an approach, which we know is very key in terms of the work that we do as women's rights actors and feminist organizers and movements. What are the reflections that you want to share with us in terms of the intricacies of accessing funding when it comes to movements, particularly in the South Asian context and Nepal, where you're from? So over to you, Manisha.
Hello, thank you. Firstly, talking about Loom, as per the experience of Loom, like Loom has been working with the flexible funding partners till date. No, we don't have such working with mainstream donors. So in such case, we are using the flexible fund to meet our need and as per the situation and support for our movement. But in case if we had the mainstream partners for the funding, it might cause like more the funding during organizing the funding. The objective of the mainstream donors also can be imposed in our movement. So that might not fulfill the need of organization and fulfill the goal of the organization. It is one thing. Another is like in the mainstreaming movement, mainly in nowadays, mainly in mainstreaming movement, mainstreaming movement in the recent context, while the movement occurs, while the movement is led by the whole movement, the whole movement is led by the individual with the supporter, no? So in that case, the resources, sharing of the resources is very difficult. So it is also one of the problem while resource sharing with the movement leaders and the supporters. So this is one of the intricacies. Another one is credibility and the eligibility of the organization. Like the small organizations, like community-based organization, they are not known by the donors. So they need the validity and validity and legitimacy. So they don't have. So the donors, they have to depend upon the mainstreaming organizations to validate those small organizations, but they are doing their movement, they are continuing their movement. So in such case also the funding is very difficult for them to get the fund. So another one is talking about in this credibility and eligibility of the organization. I want to give example of sex workers organization. Like sex workers, they are working very actively, but due to not having the verification from the mainstreaming organization, their funding, they are not funded or they are not supported for their movement. No, so if the case was if those sex workers movement organizations were supported by the mainstreaming organizations, then might be the funding would be easier to get the fund would be easier for them. No, so it is also one of the problem. Another one is the geography of the movement. Means most of the movement occurs or emerges outside the cities. So while verifying the organizations, the mainstream organization are based on the cities. So due to that, verification is difficult for them. So by not having the verification, like the movement-based organizations working outside the cities, it is also difficult for them to not get the fund from the donor organization. So another one is like mainly it is also already discussed in a previous session also, like mainly the organizations are just the funding is just limited for the capacity building and training workshops, awareness, no, but the funding are not allocated for the organization development or the group mobilization. So so in that case, such the funding is very difficult to get by such small such kind of movement. So another one is talking about, as per our experiences with the community-based organization, already said, like they are only received for the training and workshops and awareness, not for the organization sustainability or the organizational mobilizing their finance and for their sustainability to generate income for the organization so that they can sustain along with the advocacy and their movement. So these are some of the reflection from the Loom about the intricacies of the funding movement.
Thank you so much, Manisha, for pointing that out, particularly, the restrictive conditionalities that are placed on organizations that are trying to access funding in the context of actors in a movement or for movement strengthening, things around the need for the more mainstream or the more established organizations to legitimize, quote unquote, the more, perhaps groups that are operating informally or are unregistered, for instance. And of course, a very key issue, which is a question around giving funds that allow for the movement to operate sustainably in terms of the solutions that they are coming up with. So thank you very much for that, Manisha. Just before we move on to Faith, I wanted to ask you a question. Now, based on the the issues that you have highlighted, based on the work that Loom has been doing, the challenges that you've just cited, what are some of the recommendations that you would make in terms of having flexible, unrestricted, and sustainable access to quality funding for women's rights and feminist actors such as yourselves, as Loom-Nepal, and particularly those who are working on movement strengthening story? Yeah, so just recommendations that you would have to address the challenges that you have identified. Over to you, Manisha.
Thank you. Before entering to the recommendation, I want to share something about the Loom. We have SIVA project, that is the core project of the organization, where we work in a feminist accompaniment process with the community-based organizations in the areas of feminist leadership, institutional strategy, and the institutional sustainability. So also it intends to develop the organizational strategy along with the sustainability of organization through the financial funding. So with these experiences, I would like to share my recommendation as in the recent context now, the funding for the community-based organization is very important, as they hold the for the community-based organization, they are only taken as like they don't have such capacity to take the project forward. They can't hold the money or the fund that are given to them, or they don't have any experiences. But in our context, while working with the SIVA project, we realized that CBOs also have the knowledge and experience. It is just that how we can handle the how we can handle the knowledge of those CBOs systematically. So it is very important for the it is very important to get the fund for the community-based organization also. And in the context of Nepal, now the Nepal is going in the federal structure. So the funding should be directly given to the directly provided to the community-based organization, so that they can also continue the movement, as well as they can build their capacity and also to sustain further organization. Also, another one is financial sustainability of the organization. It is very important for the financial sustainability of the organization, along with taking their movement and advocacy and movement forward. They also need sustainability. They also need the part of they also need to sustain their organization. So for that also, organizations should also have some investment in different sectors. Like it can be locally available, using the locally available resources, leading towards the entrepreneurship or business model. So along with the movement, they can also take the financial sustainability of the organization. So another one is along with the investment from the community-based organization, the funder also invest in such sectors for the organization sustainability and management. Another one is movement are diversified. There's no like individual movement or individuals working in single movement. So there are diverse movements. So funding should be provided for the diverse movement also. For this, the practice can be certain criteria can be developed by the donors to address the need of the diverse group to sustain their movement. So it is one. And also the basket funding should be provided for the movement building, and set the feminist funders, set by the feminist funders. And lastly, about the collective movement. So the funding should be provided to the collective movement rather than for the just individual ones. So these are some of the recommendations from Loom. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Manisha, for those powerful recommendations. And I'm sure that, all the donors that are represented on this call have also taken note of that, alongside all the other participants that we have. So thank you for that. I have one last question around, the potential for cross-regional mobilization, but we will come back to it once I've had an intervention or the intervention with Faith. But thank you very much for that, Manisha. So up next, we're going to have Faith Lumonia, who works at Akina Mama wa Afrika. And let me tell you a little bit about Faith before we go into the discussion that we were going to have. So Faith is a development economist on her journey to becoming a feminist economist. For more than 8 years, she has worked to amplify the voices of marginalized communities in difficult policy spaces, such as the macroeconomic policy processes, specifically trade, investment, and tax at national, regional, and international levels. Her work with women casual workers in flower farms and plantations, women small-scale farmers, women owners of micro and small-scale entrepreneurs, and insufferable corporate owners and operators harnessed her appreciation for the reflective confrontation of today's capitalist society and the imperative for community engagements in influencing the change that they want. Faith has previously worked with the Southern and Eastern African Trade, Information and Negotiations Institute, and she currently works at Akina Mama as the Economic Justice and Climate Action Officer. She's also a board member of the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung East Africa office. Faith, you're welcome to the conversation. So my first question for you, Faith, is, you know, working at Akina Mama wa Afrika, which we know is one of the leading, you know, feminist Africa regional networks that we have in the African context. Akina Mama engages in transnational organizing. I just wanted to find out from you briefly what the current landscape or situation is in terms of resourcing the kind of work that Akina Mama engages in, you know, for organizations and movements within the context that you're operating in. So I hope my question is clear. If it isn't, please let me know and I'll come back to it.
No, it's clear. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for having me. I think this is a very important issue that we need to talk about, and it's very good that we are having this conversation. So just to speak about the landscape, the resourcing landscape, like we may all be familiar with the reality, it's been changing. And this is also because of a number of changes that have been happening within the aid architecture. And we've seen, for example, that civil society and NGO work now has to compete with, for example, the private sector. A lot of development financing goes to institutions like the World Bank and the United Nations that also finance private sector. So there is competition happening for resources, and that then presents a whole new dynamic to our reality. As young organizers and movement builders, we are told that in the 1990s, funding was highly flexible. It was simple to access, and we have had these stories from the experiences of some of the campaigners back then who would speak about disrupting international meetings and getting their governments to make a number of changes. And it was also because the funds were not tied to system-based complex granting procedures, requiring that, for example, you need to develop a proposal, you need to develop a log frame, your organization has to undergo organizational capacity assessment, and also that whatever you're developing has to be aligned to specific themes and objectives of the donor. Also, we are told that then international organizations, international NGOs worked very closely with the local NGOs. And it was not a donor partner relationship, it was actually a partnership to be able to cause the kind of disruption that was needed. But today things have changed, and like I said, aid is being distributed through a number of organizations, multilateral organizations like the UN and then the World Bank as well, but also through bilateral aid. So we have seen, for example, countries like the US will go into a country and create this organization, USA something, and then deliver a program through that particular entity. We have also seen that a number of funders, like for example, USAID, UKAID, DFID, are now clustering themselves into one unit, and then they create an entity that will fund. If you're, for example, from Uganda and You are probably familiar with DGF. A lot of us within the African continent are familiar with trademark, and we have seen all these changes happen. And so as a result of all these changes, we've seen that small informal organizations based in developing countries are not able to secure the resources. Also because these different funding modalities require application processes that are complicated, and they come with grantee reporting requirements. So many granting reporting requirements that it is almost difficult for like estimation for a loose coalition, for an informal group to be able to say, let's come together and influence this particular injustice that has been brought against us. If you're Kenyan, you are probably familiar with Save Lamu and the work that they did to stop the Lamu project, a coal project that had been proposed, and the government of Kenya was willing to have it implemented, and it was going to cause a lot of disruption, especially in the lives of those most marginalized, and majority of those being women. And because it was a community that just loosely put themselves together to question this injustice, and they were able to find an opportunity for funding from entities that were not really looking at requirements of proposal writing, log frames, etc. And that is how the change was able to happen. The second point I wanted to make was with regard to the professionalization that has come with all the different changes. And we've seen that international NGOs are, as a result, slowly crowding out local civil society because a lot of local civil society do not have that level of professionalism. And I don't say it in a bad way, but it also comes down to being able to have all the systems, like a lot of the previous presenters have said, having human resource manuals in place, etc. And these are some of the requirements that are being made to a lot of local CSOs today, making it very difficult. We've also seen that increasingly funding opportunities are going to those that are leaders that have positioned themselves and become prominent within the CSO space. I mean, they are also the ones who get the opportunity to attend all these high-level meetings and are able to interact with funders. And so they are able to secure all these opportunities. But again, we've seen that this has birthed a new challenge, that there are also officials within some of the donor entities who will give funding to organizations and put requirements for kickbacks. And this then affects the way the local civil society can be able to account for the financing, but even be able to reach their targeted beneficiaries. And so just to make my last point with regard to the landscape is that the resource landscape is basically imbalanced. When you look at our realities, especially in the African context, we can't just speak about strategic actions. For example, talking about advocacy and capacity building and movement building. I think it's important for us to also have a conversation about how do we develop a hybrid where we are also able to do service delivery, because the truth of the matter is that when you reach out to certain communities to engage them, to be able to challenge certain policy decisions, there are also challenges that they face. And these challenges may only be addressed if we are actually doing some kind of service delivery. I know that a recent report by Civicus also said that the science of delivery has been strangling the art of social transformation, but I think it's possible for us to be able to create a hybrid where we have groups that are doing advocacy and challenging the systemic challenges, the systemic issues that have caused their challenges to persist over the years. But it's also important for us to look at how do we actually practically empower women. When you look at, for example, women facing abuse and discrimination, when you look at women living in poverty, women casual workers and the very little money that they earn, women who have been affected by climate disasters, there is need for strategic solutions to address the underlying causes of the challenges they face and the factors that have caused these challenges. But we also need these women also need solutions now, and I think it's very important for us to create funding, resourcing opportunities that address women's urgent challenges in urgent manners. So for me, I think, and I know at this point I've already brought in what one of my recommendations is, the idea around creating a hybrid resourcing strategy. But I think this is something that we all need to look into and consider.
All right, thank you so much, Faith, for that very clear, incisive, and nuanced intervention. And perhaps because you had already gone into the territory of recommendations, and you've given us one in terms of a hybrid funding policy that, you know, really addresses the day-to-day practical needs and challenges that girls and women in their diversities experience, but in terms of also, particularly because we're centering feminist ways of doing things, challenging the structures and the systems that first of all enable the discrimination, the inequality that girls and women in their diversities face. Any other recommendations, just building on the one that you've talked about, or, you know, other different ones that also address some of the other aspects that you touched on in your intervention? So over to you, Faith.
Okay, thank you very much. And I think, well, I knew that you were going to ask the question around recommendations. And so just to reemphasize the point that I made earlier, and to sort of be able to give an example, and because so many times we speak of proposals, but it's unclear how then this would look like. And for me, the reason why I speak of that kind of strategy is because currently we are speaking about adopting intersectional approaches, and I know that because when you talk about intersectionality, we are saying that women face a multitude of challenges, and so in whatever proposal or strategy we are putting forward, it needs to be one that addresses the full spectrum of the challenges that women face, and women, but also other minoritized groups of people. And I want to refer to one experience that I had. Because, like I said, it's no longer enough for us to speak about challenging neoliberalism, capitalism, and the patriarchy. I think we also need to get into empowering women, because we also know, and from our individual experiences, that because we're empowered through education, through the financing, the fact that we have some money on us, we are able to speak up to some of these issues. So I think economic empowerment is very important. And what I wanted to share was basically a project that I was part of, where we were addressing 3 issues all at the same time. So this particular project was basically a project that was looking at socioeconomic and environment sustainability, but the target was business entities, small business enterprises, because we know that these contribute a lot. For example, when it comes to paying very low wages to their workers, not giving them proper protective gear, pollution, when it comes to environmental, the pollution within the environment. And so one of the things that the way it was designed was that there was a partner that was providing interest-free financing for the entrepreneurs. And then another one was building human resource and organizational capacity to basically help these entities improve their systems. But then there was another one that was doing advocacy and strategic engagement with, for example, government to be able to influence changes within the policy ecosystem and ensure that small producers, small-scale farmers can be able to compete against their large counterparts. And I think for me, this is something that I would want to see. Women have multiple burdens and responsibilities. So it's very important that when we go out there, when we choose to finance certain interventions, they should not look at just one problem, but look at the full spectrum of the different challenges. If it's to do, I mean, I will constantly refer to economic related examples because that is what I'm most familiar with. If it's to do with, for example, access to finance, and yet we know that the small producers also suffer from accessing.
So Faith, I'm sorry to cut in with the very good interventions that you're giving us and the examples, but we're also short for time. So that we also get to the other parts of the program, perhaps you could just give us your recommendations in summary, and perhaps because I know this is an Akina Mama project that you're talking about, we can also share that information, you know, if it's naturally, then we can share it along with all the other resources. So I'm sorry to have to cut in, but perhaps just if you could just give us your recommendations so that we can move to the other parts of the program. So thank you.
Okay. So my last recommendation, sorry about that. So my last recommendation is basically to do with more flexible resourcing. I know this was a point that was already made, but I think one of the things that we need is more flexible resources also because it's basically in the sense that system-based requirements such as the complex proposals, reporting requirements, basically hinder transformation because there are certain challenges that come and need to be addressed then, but also we need to stop the projectizing because projectizing is very limiting, and yet when you look at causing disruption in some of the and changes within the current system as it is, it needs prolonged interventions, long-term engagements, and so it's very important for us to look at the flexible approaches, but also because, and this is my final point, also because when you look at, for example, groups like the LGBTI community, and then small women, certain women groups, a lot of them have not organized themselves into formal groups, and yet they would have actually contributed. And if we do not, if we avoid if we have more flexible approaches, then we can also protect ourselves as activists from claims of terrorism and extremism that a lot of governments, especially within the African context, are currently using. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Faith, for expounding on the recommendation that you had given around considering hybrid ways of funding, and then getting us to reflect on something that other panelists had talked about in terms of projectizing the work that we do, and perhaps thinking through funding that is more sustainable, that can enable us have more long-term and sustained engagement around, the different issues that we are addressing and challenging on a day-to-day basis. So thanks for that. We're now going to move on to the next part of this agenda, and it is to have some interaction with you, the rest of the participants. And I'll ask my colleague Christina to queue up the poll, and then we'll also respond to some of the question and answer. We'll go into a question and answer session just to respond to some of the queries that are coming through, and also go through some of the comments that you're been making as we have had our discussion. So Christina, over to you for the short poll, and then we'll see whether we can respond to the question and answer.
Thank you, Kavinia. So as the poll is going on, I hope you have all received it. I can see some questions also in question and answer function. So I'll ask the wonderful panelists, all of you, to see if there are some questions or comments. Some actually are comments, not questions, that you want to comment about. There is a question: how about collaboration from the local government and community women-led organization to fund their advocacy? Absolutely, it's really important that when we talk about resourcing women's rights organization, we are taking an intersectional approach, really being mindful of who is accessing these resources directly. So it's not just about women's rights organization as a whole, but it's also to look at whether it is community-based organizations or young women organizations. Yeah, so that's really what we are hoping to do. Oh, sorry, I didn't realize I didn't have my video on. Yeah, so I was really trying to answer some of the questions in the chat. So the one on working with the local government and community-based led organizations, absolutely. How can women movement in Zambia access quality funding, especially on sexual reproductive health and rights? Most donors are funding government directly, which is welcome. However, it is community-based associations such as Zamara, which has the target audience. Yeah, that's very true again, that, community-based organization definitely deserve to access quality resources. And I do hope that we can start resource that way. Do we consider the digital capacity development to our local organization and language barriers? Yeah, this is such an important question, especially in the time when we all have moved our work to virtual working. So if there is any panelist that has any question and any comment or, ideas on thoughts on how we can make sure that the digital capacity is, is accessed by everyone who needs it, to ensure that we have good, online working, that will be great. There's a question from Nancy. Why funding requirements supposedly to support grassroots and local activism has become cumbersome and inaccessible when this was not necessarily the case some decades ago? The failure of aid system. Okay, great. So there are some questions that I have read out. Fenya, can I ask you to answer Nancy's question? What has changed? She seems to say that the cumbersomeness of accessing funding is something that has come up more recently. But also, if you can combine that question and also respond to my earlier question, which I asked you about giving us examples of those donors that have been more bold and stepped to the plate and funded feminist organizations directly, especially feminist organizations in the Global South.
Sure, of course. So what we've seen historically is that this call for core funding, flexible funding, reduced restrictions on funding, all of that has remained quite constant, unfortunately, and it's, you know, we continue repeating the same recommendations like a broken record, to be honest. But there are, as you said, some examples of donor mechanisms. Sorry, I have a cat intervention. 1 second. That have gotten it right, and you can see, I won't give all the examples, but you can see our recent reports that I'll copy in the chat afterwards. But one example is, for example, the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs, who set up the Leading from the South mechanism, where there's really an explicit focus on getting direct funding to feminist movements by working with for women's funds, so including African Women's Development Fund and the Indigenous Women's Funds, for example. And that funding is a smaller grants, core support, multi-year support, etc. And support is exclusively to feminist groups, women's rights organizations. They have open calls in different languages as well. And that there was really an intentional effort there for it to be women's fund-led, and to have deliberate efforts to share power between the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Women's Fund. So that's one where we've seen an intentional effort to connect better and to share power better with women's movements and women's funds. And then another one is an initiative of the Australian government, which is a Fiji Women's Fund. And that was actually created to address also a gap in local mechanisms. And within that fund, there are local women as well, including members of the feminist movement in the region. And that was deliberately set up to have feminist activists across the governance of the organization, which we see as kind of a best practice. Okay.
Thank you, Fenya, and we will share the report with your permission. I mean, it's publicly, so I guess we can share it, the report that has those examples as one of the follow-up. So because of time, I'm going to move us to the launch part of Her Voice Fund by Womankind, and I have an absolute honor to invite another wonderful woman who is going to help us launch this fund on behalf of Womankind. And this is Twasima Bigwira Tricia, who is a feminist lawyer, a writer from Uganda. She serves as part of the board of trustees at Womankind Worldwide and is on advisory committee of FREDA, the Young Feminist Fund. Twasima currently works with the Sego Family Foundation, where she drives strategy and oversees grant making in Uganda. Twasima, you have the floor.
Thank you, Dina. Good afternoon, everybody. As a trustee of Womankind, it is my absolute honor to be launching Her Voice Fund at a time when we can all agree that it is apparent that we need bold feminist leadership. And as we're launching this fund at a time when there's just so much multidimensional crisis that has obviously been exacerbated by the COVID-19, but also by the long-standing historic systemic injustices. And of course, we appreciate that this particularly affect women and girls and other marginalized communities more severely. Despite all the difficulties and despite all the crises, social movements and feminist movements have been rising up and using their collective voices to try and resist these oppressions and the ways in which they manifest in our societies. Now, World leaders from key sectors, including governments, businesses, civil society, and philanthropy, are meeting tomorrow under Generation Equality to try and make concrete commitments to accelerate the realization of gender equality, specifically to achieve the vision of the Beijing and the emerging challenges. There's a broad acknowledgement of the vital role that women's rights organizations specifically play, as well as the movements. And yet, despite this acknowledgement, we also know that we are largely underfunded. And as we have heard from Fenya, from AWID, less than 1% of international aid and foundations reach women's rights organizations directly. Now, this situation is even worse for women's rights organizations in the Global South, specifically those working with more marginalized communities such as young people, LGBTQI, rural women, etc., etc. It is really time to be able to bridge the gap between what we say and what we actually do. And that's why it is so heartwarming to see Womankind take this step to finally put our money where our mouth is. Now, our funding commitments have to be able to match the bold visions that women's rights organizations and feminists and collectives have. The visions are not to be focused on low-hanging fruits, but our aim must be able to transform the systemic and long-standing structural barriers that continue to allow for the manifestations of different injustices in our societies. So, excited. Her Voice Fund is a flexible fund whose overall objective is to avail flexible financial resources to women's rights and feminist organizations that are already Womankind partners. And so our hope is that we're able to take advantage with our partners of these strategic advocacy opportunities at national, regional, and international level. Her Voice Fund responds to calls for flexible resourcing of women's rights organizations, feminist movements, collectives, organizations who have long been at the forefront of mobilizing and advancing transformative visions for a more just and equal world. Policy influencing initiatives are particularly underfunded, especially with respect to organizations in communities and those addressing intersecting forms of marginalizations, like all of our speakers have shared. Now, Her Voice Fund is in line with Womankind's strategic direction towards flexible funding to all our partners in the Global South as part of our deep commitment towards shifting what we can all agree is a huge unequal power balance. It complements existing programs focused on grant making, as well as the most recent Resilience Fund, which I'm happy to say we were able to help facilitate for our partners during the challenging times of COVID-19. The fund also forms part of our commitment and the commitment that many of our partners have also made towards generation equality. So we have a call to action. Our call to action is, firstly, we have to acknowledge that the fund was launched with seed granting from our own restricted funds, and we would like to call on all of you to join us and support the voices of the courageous women, non-binary persons, and people of intersecting identities who have continued to do this work amidst great challenges. Some institutional donors and foundations are already listening to our calls for flexible funding, and they're committing long-term funding to women's rights organizations and movements. Now is definitely the time that all of us must step up and finally do the work it needs to transform our societies. If you would like to contribute, we need your money. If you would like to contribute, please email Disha. Disha is our Director of Fundraising and Marketing. Her email is going to be in the chat, but it's disha@womankind.org.uk. Now, for the women's rights organizations, we are ready to start receiving applications for funding. And if you're interested, please email hervoicefund@womankind.org.ug. They also put it in the chat, and also please continue to visit the Womankind website for more details on this. Again, I would like to say it is the honor of my, I guess, career to be able to see that this, what we have been planning at Womankind is actually coming to fruition. And I hope that you will continue to support us. Thank you. Over to you, Dina.
Thank you very much, Twasima. That's really wonderful. And just to say that there are also some case studies that we have developed that are on the website, if you would like to take a look, in terms of really hearing from women's organizations themselves, diverse women's rights organizations themselves, on the need for a fund like this. Also, I think we have already heard from our wonderful speakers about the need for resourcing feminist organizations and the need for flexible funding. I think we have heard that those that actually make sure that these funds reach grassroots community-based feminist organizations, women's funds. And so let's make sure that those resources are going directly to these organizations and funds. And I just wanted to say that because there was an issue that was raised in terms of service delivery, indeed, women's organizations don't only do advocacy, they also do service delivery, and they adapt their services to the needs of their communities. That's something we saw when COVID-19 hit, whereby women's organizations that oftentimes were focusing on policy and advocacy had to adapt very quickly to start serving their communities for their demands like, face masks, soap, food even, for those that had lost their incomes. And so we know that then if we want women's organizations to even be more adaptive, then the answer is co-funding, the answer is flexible funding, because then they can tap into those resources and use them as they wish. And even though today we are talking about Her Voice Fund, like we have heard from Twasima, Womankind also resources women's organizations to carry out such things, including programming on service delivery as they see fit. But this is simply a complementary fund that simply focuses on policy and advocacy, which also has been put in place because of the demands that have been coming from the women's rights organizations we work directly with. And so with that, I'm going to ask our wonderful panelists to just close with just one sentence each on anything that you want to say. But if some of you can touch on how resourcing would look like in terms of COVID, how does flexible funding to feminist organizations and movement look like in terms of COVID? If you want, answer, use your last sentence to answer that, or indeed just say whatever you want to say. Anyone can start.
I will start. I feel like in this difficult situation of COVID and all the multiple crises, think that not only just for women, the funding should be provided just for the women, but other diverse people, diverse community, the funding should be provided to those communities also. So that's my recommendation. Thank you.
Yeah, so for me, really, one of the statement that I wanted to share is that, and this is like a call to action to the funders, to embrace and include participatory, intersectional, and inclusive resourcing models, mechanisms, and practices that are alive to the realities of young feminist organizations and organizing for advocacy, such that we don't want support to go to New York, but we need support that will actually help us do the work, like all the work beyond the activity itself. So, and I saw a question on the chat around participatory models, and those are the models that we hope that funders will continue to embrace, that then we'll be able to ensure that then feminist organizations are able to access the funding. Thank you.
Sorry, I can go next. So I think for me, it's to reiterate the issue around flexibility, because when you look at COVID-19 and then the climate crisis poverty, gender inequality, and all the challenges that women and different minoritized groups face. I think a lot, there's need for flexibility, but I also think that it's important for us to look out for existing movements and ongoing campaigns that we know are actually making a change and funding them, because there are a lot of them out there. Like we said, we're in a digital era, but there are those that have been left out. So maybe it's important for us to pick up that phone or send an email to someone who you know can physically walk to those groups of people and bring them on board. Thank you.
Yeah, I completely agree. The call for long-term flexible resources remains, constant. And particularly, I think also trust movements to know what they need the resources for, and especially movements at the intersection of different oppressions and cross-movement work.
Thank you very much all. Thank you, wonderful panelists, for sharing knowledge with us and expertise. Thank you to all of you for attending. And for me, my closing sentence, I just want to reflect on a statement I had yesterday from the Black Feminist Fund session yesterday, where one of the panelists, actually she's Nakrata, who works with Ford Foundation, she said, fund Black feminists as if you want them to win. And I say, fund feminist organizations and movements as if you want them to win, because that's where change comes from. So thank you very much. We are going to share the recording with you after this. And also, if there are any questions that we have not been able to answer because of time, we are going to answer them. And just to say that if you have any questions, please do reach out to us. Any questions about the Her Voice Fund or indeed about anything else. And please donate if you can, so that we can grow this fund. So the idea is to grow the fund so that we can make these resources flexibly to women's rights organizations who are the front line of change. Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful time and enjoy Generation Equality Forum. And yes, let's continue to call for accountability for everyone who is talking about gender equality, to be accountable to women and girls and organizations that represent them. Thank you very much.